Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychology in My Kitchen. I am Mrs. Ryan from Sylvania Northview High School, and today we are continuing to talk about the first unit in AP Psychology, which is an introduction to the history and approaches to psychology. So in my last video, we talked about the roots of psychology, where is it stemmed from, how does it work. We're continuing with that today and looking at what's known as the approaches in psychology. So something to note, they go by a couple of different names. So you might hear me say approaches or perspectives or schools of thought. They all basically mean the same thing. So in psychology, our big question is, why do people do the things that they do, right? We want to know why people think and behave a particular way, and we utilize the scientific method in psychology to figure that out. But of course, we come back to the explanation piece, right? We ask this question, why does someone behave a particular way? Now we got to go about answering it. And this is where sometimes psychology can get a little muddy, in that, unlike some other types of subject matter, for an example, mathematics, you always have a concrete, singular, correct answer to an equation, or at least for the most part. I don't really remember too much advanced math. But in psychology, it doesn't work that way, because you're talking about human beings. Human beings are complex creatures who, while they might behave one way in a certain situation, they might have that same situation happen and they don't act that way again, or they continue to act that way. And so we don't always get super clear-cut answers to our question about why people do the things that they do. So in psychology, we have several different approaches or ways that we're going to try to go about answering that question about why we do the things that we do. So if you recall, in our last lesson, when we talked about some of our major psychologists, early psychologists, things like that, we talked about Edward Titchener. And Titchener was interested in the idea of structuralism and looking at the elemental structures of the mind. And he's actually one of the first perspectives in psychology, in that the mind has these certain elements and we're trying to figure out what those elements are. But because he didn't have any real way of proving that information, that theoretical approach, that perspective, goes away. And so today we're going to look at some of the perspectives that we still think happen. So these are our contemporary perspectives in psychological study. So one of those is actually a German perspective, and it came pretty early on, around the time of Titchener, and it's something known as Gestalt. Gestalt, one word. And Gestalt is a German word that means whole, or to create a whole form. And part of Gestalt, and in Gestalt psychology, we look at how the brain, instead of trying to look at these like elemental pieces, all these different parts of the brain, we got to treat it as a whole. And so studying the brain as a whole and how it works as a whole, that is a part of Gestalt. And one of the ways that we really see that actually is in our unit of sensation and perception, and more specifically, looking at visual illusions or optical illusions, things that can appear in different ways. So for example, my pictures that I have on the bottom here, they've got a couple of different things going on in them. So we have, like, is it two faces or is it a vase? Do you see the tree or the gorilla and the lion, the woman's face or the man playing the saxophone? And one of my favorites, and this is a really great example of Gestalt, is this one right here at the end. Is there a triangle there? Do you see a triangle? I can see a triangle, but is there a triangle there? Well, the answer, of course, is that there isn't. There is no triangle in that picture. But your mind filled it in. Your mind put that image together and it sees a triangle that doesn't exist. And so this is one of the reasons why Gestalt psychology is focused on the idea that I can't just study the brain, like for example, in vision and how I see, because there's more going on there, right? I see a triangle that doesn't exist, and my brain is filling that information in for me. This is a thing called closure. And so in Gestalt psychology, we talk about how it can't just be these little elemental parts. It's got to be the whole that we're going to study. So that's going to come back up again in Unit 5, Sensation and Perception. Now, this guy is another one that we already mentioned before, and that, is, of course, is Mr. Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud, in all of his interestingness about how he feels that a lot of our behavior stems from things that happened in our childhood, and those things that happened in our childhood we don't remember, that they're there in my mind, but they're part of this unconscious, and so it's something that I don't realize is something that I think about. So this idea of his actually becomes a perspective of psychology. Now, I will tell you, because Freud is such a controversial figure, you do have a lot of people who think that the psychoanalytic or the psychodynamic perspective isn't a thing. You still have a lot of people who are his followers, these neo-Freudians, who are going to make arguments that, you know, your childhood and the things that happen in your childhood do have a really significant impact on who you're going to become and whether or not you are a happy, healthy, well-adjusted adult. And those might be things that you don't consider, you don't think about. So here's a fun personal story of Mrs. Ryan. So, a long time ago, when I was I probably would have been like 11, 12, something like that. Just starting to become interested in boys. There is a boy who I grew up with. I will not share his name as this is going out on the internet, but I liked him. And at one point, I think he might have liked me, and that, you know, went away or whatever. But there was a day in the summer where all the neighborhood kids are hanging out and that sort of thing. And I remember it was the summer because I was wearing a very specific, like, 4th of July kind of getup, where it was these star shorts, and I had on a red t-shirt that had stars around the collar. And he said to me that I looked like the Kool-Aid Man. Oh yeah. And his reference was the idea that I was overweight and that I looked like this big Kool-Aid guy, right? And of course, that's upsetting to me. As any kind of prepubescent girl is going to talk about that. You know, you're often really self-conscious, especially about the way that you look. Here you have somebody teasing you about something that you're wearing. You know, this is kind of crisis mode, right? And so now, as an adult woman, I don't wear a lot of red. Now, it's not like I have no red in my closet or anything, but the psychoanalytic perspective might make the argument that if I'm shopping, right, I'm at the store or I'm on Amazon or something like that, and I'm looking through prospective pieces of clothing, that I am not immediately drawn to wearing red clothes. And of course, another argument might be, well, she wears a lot of blue or teal and things like that because it you know, makes more sense with my hair color or my eye color. But I don't wear a lot of red. And the psychoanalytic perspective would make this argument, this explanation of my behavior, saying that I don't wear a lot of red because unconsciously I think about being teased for the way that I looked when I specifically wore a red shirt. And so when I am in this situation in which I'm choosing clothing, I don't go towards red clothes. Now, is this true or not? I don't really know. I mean, I haven't bought a whole lot of new clothes lately, right? Just hanging out at home. Um, but that's what the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytic perspective is about. That what's the driving force behind your behaviors, things that happened in your childhood that you don't consciously remember. It's not something that you think about all the time. Okay. So, like I said, there are people who don't believe in this perspective at all, but it still kind of pops up every once in a while. But these right here are actually are more common contemporary perspectives in psychology. And so they are the biological, the cognitive, the evolutionary, and the social cultural. Sometimes you get the humanistic perspective thrown back in there, and we talked about that in our last lesson, where Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow really focused on the idea that human beings are trying to become their best selves. Okay, so that is also sometimes considered a contemporary perspective. But these four really are major ones. We start with the biological perspective. So we have a saying in psychology that everything psychological is simultaneously biological. So everything psychological is simultaneously biological. What does that mean? Well, it's talking about the idea that every time you have a thought or a feeling or a dream, or you create a memory, or you retrieve that memory out of your mind, there is a biological process that is making all of that happen. Like right now, there's a whole biological process that is happening within myself to speak these words to you. Okay, it's like a program. And so when we say that everything psychological is simultaneously biological, we mean that there are biological elements to us that can also drive our behavior. And so we might look at things like the messaging systems within our bodies. So things like my hormonal output, are my hormones fluctuating the way that they should? I might look at my neurotransmitters and the neurotransmitter production. Neurotransmitters are going to be the chemical messengers that are created and sent through my neurons. So they work very similar to hormones, but hormones come from glands and they travel through blood. But they're still chemical messengers. And sometimes I might make too much of one, or I might make too little, and that can affect the overall behavior that I'm experiencing. We also know that overall brain activity, right? How active my brain is, how my brain is able to function, that actually impacts how I'm going to behave. In fact, I just read an article this morning that was talking about the importance of sleep. And it was saying how when we are sleep deprived, these glia cells that are in my brain that help like clean up toxins and stuff like that, they make my brain like super wonderful, and it works the way that it's supposed to. When I am sleep deprived, they start eating my brain cells. So when you feel like that horrible grogginess and you start to like not be able to cognitively do stuff because you're so incredibly sleep deprived, it's because your brain isn't functioning the way that it's supposed to. You're losing out on brain cells and the connections from those brain cells, which is really the important piece. You're losing that because of sleep deprivation, because the glia cells are eating you, and they're not supposed to do that, but they do. So this biological perspective is a way that I go about answering my question about why do we do the things that we do based off of somebody's specific biology. So what is physically going on in their bodies. Now, my cognitive perspective. My cognitive perspective is focused on the idea that people do not process information and do not remember, they don't store and retrieve information exactly the same way. And so this, of course, can have an impact on how I might behave. For example, you have probably been in a situation, maybe like with your family, for example, and there was an event that took place, right? And maybe in that event, somebody got hurt, or somebody was really embarrassed, or somebody was really surprised, whatever. But you're sitting around the table and you are talking about that event, and you're talking about the things that happen. And maybe an argument ensues because one person remembers it this way and another person remembers it this way. And they're both yelling at each other because they're like, I was there and I know what happened. No, I was there. I know what happened. Right. And they were both there. Right. And they both had this exact same scenario happen. They were in this moment and they don't remember it the same way. And how does that happen? Well, it happens based off of, what were my feelings at the time? How well do I actually remember the event? What kind of events have happened since then that can actually change the memory that I have of that event? And so this cognitive perspective is looking at how I think and feel about the world and how that actually influences the behavior that I have. And newsflash, people think differently. They do not process events the same way that you do. And so you might be standing next to somebody and they look at something and they're like, wow, this is so amazing. And you look at it like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. Why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do with your background, but that's your cognitive thinking, right? And so this cognitive perspective is a way that we're explaining behavior based off of the way a person thinks and feels and processes the information they encounter on a regular basis. So then we come to the evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary perspective is really interesting because it looks at human beings as a species, okay? How have we evolved as a species? How have we changed as a species? And how does our behavior then impact the way that, we change? Because we look at, genetic changes take generations for that to really come about. And so that immediate change that can happen, evolutionary perspective looks at, how have humans progressed essentially. And so one of the big places that we actually see the evolutionary perspective play out in a really, really concrete way has to do with fear. Okay. So one of the reasons why human beings have this emotion of fear is because we want to survive, right? And we need to be able to recognize if we are in a dangerous situation, how might I deal with that dangerous situation that's going to increase the likelihood that I survive. So if I were to ask you, what is it that you fear? I can tell you that people listening are going to have very similar fears. And the top ones are going to include things like snakes, spiders, as well as other types of bugs. Heights tend to be a real scary one for a lot of people. And then also small spaces. So small spaces is what we might call like claustrophobia. So if you take something like flying in an airplane, lots of people have problems with flying in an airplane. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. One, you have the height thing, you have the enclosed space, the not being able to be in control, a lot of stuff going on there that if you look at our early ancestors, those are things that they should have feared. Because if they feared them, they were much more likely to survive. So you think about, somebody who doesn't have a fear of heights. Well, I might just go jump off this mountain. Ha ha ha, it'll be fine, splat. Right? Like, so you're a person who is fearful of that. They were much more likely going to survive and they're going to procreate and they're going to have kids who also increase their likelihood of surviving because they have that fear. Because if you think about it, how many people are going to die from something like a spider bite? Now, if you live in Australia, the entire continent is trying to kill you. Okay, all the wildlife. You gotta say, but like, if you live in Northwest Ohio, which is where I live, your likelihood of dying from a spider bite is super duper small. Okay, but spider comes crawling across, your desk or something like that, or it crawls across your foot. Yeah, right. We get all freaked out about that. It's probably not going to do anything. But like, I know after school, I get all these kids who walk out into the parking lot and they're not like, ah, it's a car. You are much more likely, unfortunately, please be safe, but you are much more likely to get hurt by a vehicle in some sort of car accident than you are being hurt by being bitten by a spider. But that's not what we fear. And so evolutionary perspective looks at how have these tendencies of our ancestors um, changed our behavior down the line, evolutionary perspective. And then finally, we talk about the social cultural perspective in influencing our behavior. So, your social or your cultural environment playing a major role in what your behavior is likely going to be in any given situation. This is going to influence things like the way that I dress, okay, what is considered appropriate clothing from the situation that I'm in, from the culture that I live by, and even things like how close two people stand to one another. In the United States, we have these big bubbles that go around ourselves, and we don't like when people are invading personal space. Whereas in other cultures, it's a much smaller amount of space that you would have between yourself and another individual, and that's not considered something that is strange, for example. Um, Another thing, you might be aware that if you were not to listen to me speaking, but if you only saw this video, um, a lot of people would probably be able to guess that I am from the United States. And one of the reasons why you'd probably be pretty sure that I am American is because I smile a lot. Because as Americans, we tend to smile a lot. And that's a cultural piece. And there's some actually evolutionary theory as to why we smile so much, but that would influence, right, my behavior. Is that if I am brought up in society where you smile a lot, you make a lot of eye contact, that those are behavioral differences that can explain why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. So again, these perspectives are, or approaches, or schools of thought, all things that we might call this. These are all ways that we are going about attempting to answer our question about why people do the things that they do. And so it's built upon kind of what we learned in that early psychology and what some of our early psychologists believed about the human mind and human behavior. But these are more of our contemporary viewpoints and ways in which we attempt to explain behavior that we encounter. And this can go from anything like, you think somebody is so wonderful and somebody else thinks that they're a jerk. This is all about how we're attempting to explain behavior. So that's going to be it for today. In our next lesson, we're going to start looking at some different careers in psychology. Until then, hope you have a great day.